We're here with Kendall Allen, veterinary and wildlife scientist and documentarian, who's working on the Phillip Island conservation success story. As it is often described as a conservation success story, from your perspective, what have been the most significant achievements in recent years?
Yeah, so Phillip Island is a huge conservation success story, and one of the real reasons why we wanted to produce this documentary was to let everyone know about the species that are obviously famous for their conservation and their recovery, but also the species that are lesser known around Phillip Island that tourists can still go and see and visit and experience the conservation efforts and protecting of these species. But no one can mention Phillip Island without mentioning the little penguin colony, one of the biggest colonies in Australia. Travel to Phillip Island every single night, brings in people all around the globe to come see these little penguins. A real testament on how all these animals can travel to the island and still survive. But with that, the penguin colony did have a bit of a raw history. So back in 1970 and 80, I believe, there was a Summerland Peninsula development happening, housing development and infrastructure, which pretty much pushed our little penguins on the brink of extinction. There was many species that were dying and were getting disorientated and just didn't have a home. They were dying because they didn't have a home and they weren't sure what to do. But luckily, thankfully in 2010, they created the Penguin Reserve Project, which was run by Phillip Island Nature Parks. And what they did was they really put a lot of funding and time and effort in things such as habitat restoration, making sure there's haven for other species that come to the island, monitoring traffic going in there, tourism going in there, and to also not just focus on our penguins, but all our other crucially important species such as our eastern bar bandicoots, and which is a success story as well in itself. That they were once extinct in the wild, but through conservation projects and partnering with Zoos Victoria and their breeding programs, they've now released the Ismail bandicoots back on Phillip Island, where they're striving, and the population is now increasing, and have also now been degraded from extinct to now just threatened, which is a huge success. Which is only one of many species that the island has to offer.
That's fantastic. It's great to see that a lot of the ecotourism and habitat restoration is actually working in species conservation. We do know that the removal of invasive species like foxes is often highlighted as a turning point as well. How important was this in shaping the future for native wildlife here?
Yeah, so one of the main things that Phillip Island did was to make it a safe haven for our native species and species traveling there. They had to really strategically think about what is the main predator, the main cause of these species to go extinct. And what they found was that foxes, as we are well aware, is a very top predator and has destroyed massive amounts of our native wildlife there. So what Phillip Island did, and nature parks and the rangers there, was to try and really eradicate all foxes from the island and even feral cats as well. They have completely eradicated red foxes. There still talks about feral cats. Only issue is that because there is a main bridge that goes from the main inland, which is San Remo, to the island, there is still the possibility of foxes, feral cats arriving to the island and causing dramatic effects with that conservation. But however, with that though, they've been able to put constant surveillance on that bridge. They've got people working 24/7, 7 days a week to make sure that these foxes and feral cats aren't traveling to the island. And also, when the tides are low, make sure those foxes don't travel across the island either. With the constant community engagement, community monitoring, nature park monitoring, and officers looking for keeping on cameras, they're able to identify that there are no foxes, and that if there are foxes there, that there's swift emergency action to prevent the fox doing some serious damage. Why the foxes are so dramatic to our conservation is that we on Phillip Island we have a lot of nesting birds such as penguins. We have bushstone curlews, short-tailed shearwaters that arrive here every year. With that happening is that they're prone to getting predated on from foxes coming there. Once they're in the nesting grounds or in the habitat, the foxes, it's easy access, can attack and destroy large amounts of wildlife in one night. It's not so much just one animal here and there. There's mass amounts of casualties in just one night with feral cats and foxes. That's been proven through research and data of other invasive species throughout different environments as well. Um, But from the removal and eradication of all foxes, we're seeing a great bounce back of our native wildlife. We're seeing the short-tailed shearwaters travel. We travel over 15,000 kilometers to be in Phillip Island, to have pristine nesting grounds. The eastern barred bandicoots being released back on the island that were once extinct, and now only in recent years seeing the bushstone curlew that was once extinct on the island as well. To finally be able to see them being released, which only happened a few months ago, is a clear testament on what can really happen when you remove foxes off the island and control feral cats as much as possible. And it's not only just from the hard efforts with the rangers, but it's all part of government organisations parting with it, providing grants, as well as community engagement, wanting to stand by what the conservationists are doing on that area, and to all have the same mindset of what they want to do to protect our wildlife that brings not only a lot of ecotourism, but a lot of joy to a lot of people, but also keep species striving and remove them from the brink of extinction.
It's actually incredible to see how successful predator control has been. Beyond that, do you think that there are any habitats or ecosystems on the island itself that stand out to you as a real restoration success?
Yeah, so what we're seeing, these smart bandicoots, they're not so much on Phillip Island, but they're on Churchill Island, just off Phillip Island. And what they've done is they've been working with a lot of researchers and scientists and head scientist Duncan over there as well, who have really put time and effort in removing invasive species, invasive plant species, and really providing native grasses and habitat that eastern barred bandicoots strive in. And to see how those vegetation have been placed there, and see how the eastern barred bandicoots have actually not just been placed there and they're just getting by, they're actually striving on that land, could really show that with proper care and consideration, trying to find the right vegetation that suits species specific vegetation is a big thing as well. Can really see how it's super important for these species to strive. As well on that, there is also all the coastal dunes and things like that. A lot of those places have been zoned off to prevent foot traffic, tourists going there and visiting the habitat. Obviously, Phillip Island Nature Parks want to have tourism there. They want people to come there because when tourism comes there, it brings money into the environment, to the nature parks, which can be put straight back into conservation, straight back into protecting our critically endangered species. But they need to make sure it's controlled so that they don't do one step forward, two steps back. So they continue to monitor it. They continue to have researchers looking at the vegetation to see if it's striving in the area. And if there is invasive vegetation that seems to pop up, there is a team that continue to just remove those invasive species and try to put better plants there to provide safe spaces and feeding grounds, and to really help with that ecosystem recovery.
Touching on ecosystems, we do know that little penguins obviously are one of the main focuses on the island itself, especially regarding tourism. What lesser known or overlooked species do you think also depend on similar ecosystems?
I think a lot of species that travel to the island rely on a healthy, striving ecosystem. And we can see that with these species surviving and striving on the island, shows that, and it makes us question if there wasn't a healthy, say, vegetation, or there wasn't so much control and management on the island. What would the outcome be? Would these species still be able to survive? Would they still be traveling from thousands of kilometers to Phillip Island? And it's something that they continue to invest in. They really want to make sure that it's not just a refuge for our local communities, but also our migratory species that travel as well. It's also a main highway for a lot of species, such as the humpback whales. They travel all the way from Antarctica, go through Phillip Island to get to the warmer weathers up near Gold Coast and up in the warmer environments, to then have their calves come back through Phillip Island and head back to Antarctica. Now, if the waters weren't maintained and there wasn't control with things like microplastics or conservation initiatives with nature parks Phillip Island, what would be the outcome for those whales traveling that far away? Will it be a conservation success, or will it be something that we need to really start thinking about? But not only the largest species, but we also have a great crested terns where they have one of the most biggest populations, just based near the Nobbies as well. With that there, I know that Nobbies and the nature parks continue to plant important breeding nesting for them. just on the cliffs of the knobbies, so the grey crest terns can breed there comfortably, but also coexist with other seabirds such as your seagulls that breed there as well. There are a lot of kelp gulls that go there to prey on a lot of the chicks there as well. So when planning all this stuff, it's really making sure that we focus on not just the big pictures of our penguins, but the other species that travel through there as well. We have a lot of cool little species that live there as well that are less known, but there's no reason that we should be making a priority for a certain species because to have a healthy ecosystem, you need to be able to have a thriving and a diverse ecosystem. It's not so much as having one population of one species that classifies as diverse, but having a variety of different species to help the balance of the circle of life, the balance of the species thriving, the food availability resources. Having that diverse ecosystem can really help with all of our species that are on the island as well. And it is a sanctuary for our native species, but our migratory species. Um, but we want to highlight all these other lesser known species in this documentary to let them know that they're not just about the penguins, and penguins are great, and there still needs to be a lot of conservation for the penguins. However, we want to highlight other species through this documentary.
So we have mentioned quite a lot of flagship species and touching on those lesser known species as well. Is there a particular species that might be your favorite that you think needs to be a little bit more in the spotlight?
Yeah, and I think one of the species I love in this fight is the little ones that aren't sort of looked upon. They're sort of frowned upon. They don't really look at it. We can look at the big flagship species of like a humpback whale traveling there, and we can look at the massive colonies of penguins. But it's a little species that I personally find really cool to think about, and thinking about that these species are just as important as our massive colonies. Species such as our hooded plovers. They're a little tiny walking, wandering bird. We've got amazing colors, a really vibrant red ring around its eye, super super tiny. And if you don't look closer, you could probably lose them because they're so small, and you can question them for a little rock on the beach. Um, Such small species, but such an important part of conservation is protecting them as well. This threatened species is still needs a lot of work, still needs a lot of conservation effort, still needs a lot of funding, still needs a lot of time, manpower to really start protecting this species. Because one of the problems is with when we're trying to protect species at a very hot tourist place is trying to how do we balance ecotourism? How do we balance people coming to pay to come and see these amazing species, and then put the money back into conservation, but also protect species that may be exposed to all of the over tourism as well. And there's many species that are affected by the over tourism. The short-tailed shearwaters are affected by tourism as well. And hooded plovers are definitely affected by tourism. And the reason why hooded plovers is so affected by tourism is because where they nest is on the beaches that public go to. They're on the coastlines, in the vegetations near the sand dunes. Um, so what happens there is when people take their dogs down there and the dogs are having fun, getting all wet and loving the time on the beach, they can actually get their nesting grounds tracked on by people trying to either collect the ball that's being thrown up in the area, or people just being curious to look what's up there, as well as dogs just living their dream, loving it, running around on the beach. So there needs to be a lot of proactive ways, and how can we manage this balance out? And when it comes to conservation, there needs to be a balance. We need to make sure that what we do is not just the answer isn't locking everything up and saying this is what we need to do. The answer is how can we coexist with people coming in, with our community, with our animals, but also how can we generate people who have that passion for our species. And so what Phillip Island have done to protect these species is rezoned they've zoned off a lot of areas where the hooded plovers are nesting. They've made hours differ from when dogs come and play in the park, or play in the park in the beach, to where the hooded plover's breeding season is. So they want to really make sure people still come and visit Phillip Island, still enjoy the ocean, still enjoy the beach, because that's what helps them have that grounding and realize that there's something that we should be protecting. But also we protect species that call the beaches home. And it's monitored by rangers constantly. There's patrols all the time. As I said before, they close off certain parts of the beach when there's breeding seasons. And it's not so much as like it can be an inconvenience for people wanting to visit the beach, But I think it's also a great way and a great eye into how can we, a great eye for the people who are visiting Phillip Island to realize actually this is something that we want to protect. We're coming here, we're seeing the land we have, we're seeing the ocean, we're seeing the land, but if we don't protect the animals that I love to see, then will I really want to come to Phillip Island? It's something that is a really good balance. I think um, species like that can really be still needs a lot of work, but can really be utilized as this is something that we can protect and look after for our islands. Um, and yeah, and through zoning off loans, we're finally seeing the hooded plover population increase. They were decreasing with all the human trafficking and predation, foxes and all sorts of stuff. But since they've eradicated foxes and are starting to really control them onto the beaches, we're seeing population actually increase, which is super exciting for the little favorite animal that I've got, the cane owl on the beach.
Yeah, it's definitely an animal that I haven't ever looked out for before. So I think the next time I go down there, it'll be on my radar,
Definitely,
and I'll be keeping an eye out for it.
definitely.
So we've talked about a species that calls Phillip Island its home. So migratory species are a huge part of the ecology. Which species travel here each year, and why do you think Phillip Island is such a critical stop or breeding site for them?
Yeah, that's a great question. We know even if we change things around, these animals still want to migrate as well. But what we've been noticing is that we're seeing some changes in our migration patterns. So what we do see, we have short-tailed shearwaters arrive every single year around late August, early September, and they come in thousands, colonies of thousands, and they're traveling over 15,000 kilometers all the way from an island just off Alaska, traveling and doing the 15,000-kilometer trek in under a few weeks, which is just extraordinary. We're seeing humpback whales use the oceans as a highway for the yearly migration that doesn't really stop; it just keeps happening. But we also see a lot of other species that maybe not really known about, like our red-necked skins, our ruddy turnstones. We're also seeing various other species come to the island. And what we asked ourselves is, well, why is, as you mentioned, why are these species traveling here? The reason we look at it is because if you take away its number one predators being foxes, and if you start controlling its apex predator being humans trying to trek on their land, when you start looking at re-vegetating land and removing invasive species and putting in foods that are ideal habitat, foods that areas that they can nest and places that they can feel safe, um, that's controlled by rangers on a constant basis, you start seeing an increase of these species arrive there because they feel safe to stay here. But on that as well, though, we need to also remember that we have seen patterns of this migration changing. We have seen short-tailed shearwaters arrive a lot later in the year. We've seen a decrease in short-tailed shearwaters arrive on the island due to other things like climate change, with the danger from traveling all the way here, the temperature and how the environment changes to let them know that we need to start heading to Phillip Island. All these things all can contribute to the issues that we have with our work. So what we need to try and remember is we need to try and continue to monitor these species, fix them up, and make sure that we can really focus on how we can allow them to raise their young successfully, but also allow them um, to continue to have food abundance and continue to do habitat restoration, and to really monitor human trolls and human movement on those parts of the island.
So we've mentioned short-tailed shearwaters quite a few times in our conversation. What do you think their main challenges on the island actually are?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Obviously, it's a huge success that these species are traveling so far to be on this island, but it's a very exciting and a successful sort of outcome for them. But it also can be quite disturbing to see the outcome that they have to get there. These species that are traveling 15,000 kilometers in under 2 or 3 weeks. To anyone to think that that's a very, very, very long time, and they only stop to eat very quickly, but they keep traveling. But once they get here, they finally get to the island. They're starting to get nesting, and once they've nested, they've got their pristine environment. Um, what they start finding is that once their young have hatched, the young need to also head back to the ocean to then travel the whole entire migration again to do the whole cycle again. But what seems to be a problem that we've noticed with Phillip Island as well is the light pollution that's around Phillip Island. Obviously, it is an island that is based around our conservation and is focused on conservation and brings in all amounts of ecotourism. But with the large amounts of ecotourism, we have a lot of light pollution that come on the island. People with headlights driving, where the penguin parade is, driving in the Nobbies, driving in areas where shorter shearwaters may be nesting, but also the main towns of cows and areas around Phillip Island as well. So what happens with that light pollution is that when these young have just hatched and they're just about to go on their migration, they actually start getting disorientated with the light that's around. So much so that they will just fly directly into oncoming traffic, and the completely the opposite direction that they're meant to be going. So what they like to do, and what Philippine nature parks do, and the volunteers and the community support do there, is they do a collect shearwater time and rehab chicks. So when the chicks are about to go on their fly back to the island just about Alaska on that 15,000 kilometer trek, they actually catch those shorter shearwaters that may land on the roads or be hit by cars and rehabilitate them. Considering obviously they are wild animals, trying not to make them too comfortable with human interaction. And then once they've been filmed, recovered them, releasing them back to go back on their 15,000 kilometer journey. But not only going back to where they've come from, but the short-haired shearwaters arriving to the island do have a lot of issues in regards of bycatch and pollution, a lot of microplastics, as it's really well aware of microplastics in the water now, how they're a massive effect on not just our shorebird sort of species or seabird species, but all of our large mammals as well. Climate change is also impacting, as mentioned before, traveling at different times of the year, flying back different times of the year. There could be different environmental factors that may affect them flying back than what they're used to. So all these things can really affect the short-haired shearwater on their journey. And even though we do see the short-haired shearwaters come with millions and millions of individuals, we see a lot of them die as well, which is definitely not something to be happy about. Something that we should really start monitoring. How can we make it better? What can we do to minimize the casualties we get with short-tailed shearwaters? And there seems to be a lot of work done, but there are a lot of work with that. So, as mentioned, the Phillip Island volunteers do stuff to rehab them, but they also do a lot of road control, and they have make sure that in certain parts of the island, the headlights are actually turned off. Driving on those islands, and they're guided by a patrol car and other signs to help tourists find where they're going. To really help these species thrive. We can only do little parts, but every little thing we do can have a huge impact on these species because we want to see these other species arrive back to the island in the next year, in the next annual migration. So collectively working and respecting our ranges and obeying by those road signs, as well as the volunteers helping, can really help with protecting these species, strive from their massive migration, and also reducing light pollution, making sure that if you've got outdoor lights on, if you're not out there outside, then you can turn them off and let the species actually get a better chance of finding their way back home.
Amazing. It's really hard to hear how the human wildlife conflict and industrialization has impacted species such as the short-tailed shearwaters. We did touch a little bit on climate change. How do you think that will be affecting any migratory or vulnerable species in the future?
Yeah, so the way the climate is changing, we are seeing the migration change quite a bit. We're usually seeing them at the end of August, early September, but we're now only seeing them mid-September to end of September, going into October. Which isn't fully uncommon, but it is a fact that we have to consider. Why is this happening? Why are these species traveling a little bit later and arriving a little later than what they originally were? As well as food availability. If there's food that if the climate's changing a lot, is the food that they're traveling from their massive trek, is that being affected? Is there warmer temperatures in the waters that's making their food source actually die, or food source be not as present or as prominent on their travel here? Um, and we also see, shorebirds and penguins and lesser breeding um, their success is not as good as what they were once the climate back in the day when we didn't have massive climate change crisis happening. Um, but by responding by habitat protection and doing wetland restoration, as well as species monitoring and providing flexible strategies to really assist with these species surviving in this time, can really aid wildlife surviving in the long run. But it is definitely something we need to focus on. But I think as the climate changes, we need to continue to adapt our management plan for it. We can't just sit and realize that climate change is happening and we're just going to keep the same tools we've done for hundreds of years. We're actually going to start how can we adapt with the climate to be one step ahead so that we're not two steps behind it. So that if things do change, we are ahead to be able to make sure that we're prepared. We have emergency preparedness for the species, that we have breeding programs, we have zoos that are holding species that may be breeding in captivity that can be released back in the wild successfully. So we just need to constantly be prepared for what will be happening, as we're commonly seeing it change, seeing different things change. But I think if we're well prepared, we can definitely stay one step ahead of this changing climate.
So we see a lot of narrative and storytelling around climate. How do you think scientific communications, such as documentaries, are going to help vulnerable species and change our views on how we are impacting the planet?
Yeah, I think scientific communication is a very, very powerful tool when used correctly. A lot of people who may be scientists or maybe have experience that is outstanding and trying to communicate conservation to people who may not be that trained or academically aligned to understand the lingo and the conversation that's being done that doctors and PhDs and all sorts of people have been doing in their years and years of studying, that I find that when communicating to the public, we need to be aware that we don't use our scientific lingo. We need to obviously have our facts. We need to explain clearly of what we want, but we also make sure that we let people know that it's easy for them to understand. And it is too easy for scientists to get in their little in their tangent on science and stats and data, but we need to ask ourselves: is that actually going to be what's going to help species strive? Is that going to really help animals come from the brink of extinction? It's something to definitely we need to consider. And with doing things like documentaries, I find that having that emotional response to let people and the public view documentary have sort of an emotional attachment to what they're seeing, but also the knowledge that they may not have had when they're in school or when they've been visiting Phillip Island or when they've been um, seeing doing their studies, even that. Giving them an insight of what the conservation efforts are in Phillip Island, that's not just on a pamphlet of little penguins, can really help them have a bigger place in their heart to be able to strive and protect species that we all love to visit so many times through our year in our holidays, all sorts of stuff. We want to provide understanding, and the documentaries aren't just a fairy tale. It's not so much just this is a story of a species that is really cool, but let them know that this is actually really happening on the island. This is really the hard work being put in to protect this species, but not only just protecting species just for the sake of it, but why are we protecting these species? Why are they so important for conservation? Why do they have their part to play with our world, with our ecosystems, to make a healthy environment for all of us to strive on? So I think when doing scientific communication, it's a really one thing to really just take your eyes away from, you know, let's just get the data out, the stats out, but let's just put ourselves in the animal's mindset on how they're struggling, how they're surviving, how they're traveling miles and miles to be here, to survive on a land that has once was being developed for housing, but is now an abundant of vegetation and native uh, wildlife and all things like that. So it's really just change that perspective of a great video to watch, and that's cool. But actually, this is why the animal's here.
So we can clearly see that you're passionate around conservation, particularly on Phillip Island. What role do you hope this documentary will play in raising people's awareness around more vulnerable species?
I want viewers to see beyond the penguins and understand the hidden stories of Phillip Island. They're quite often unseen species that are just vital for its ecosystem and conservation. And the conservation isn't just only about the headline animals, but it's about every life that depends on the fragile balance. If this documentary can make people pause, wonder, and feel the sense of responsibility for even the smallest creatures, then we've taken a step towards protecting not only the island's wildlife, but the future of nature itself.
Thank you so much for sitting down with us.
Thank you very much.